If you're frustrated with politics, you're not alone. We all are, to one extent or another. But there's a way to fix our nation's broken political culture that's actually a lot more straightforward than you think.
If we step back and allow a government to happen to us, instead of take our active role in the government we have been warned that's exactly what we'll get. It will be imposed upon us.
On this episode, we discuss a new guide for Americans who are tired of the status quo and want to reclaim the ideas that have helped make this nation the greatest on earth. You're listening to Defending Ideas. Defending Ideas is a weekly podcast produced by Sutherland Institute. On this show, we are committed to renewing the principles of common sense conservatism, making you a better champion of sound ideas. Welcome back to another episode of Defending Ideas. I'm your host, Nic Dunn, and this week we're talking about things that are very relevant during a contentious election year, which of course we find ourselves in right now, but we're not really going to talk about politics and the campaigns. We're going to talk about something actually more important that provides the context in which those things happen. That is the idea of long-standing principles and ideas. Think of it as the climate in which our policy and political debates take place. And to have this conversation, I'm excited to be joined by Rick Larsen, who's the president and CEO here at Sutherland Institute. Rick, welcome back to Defending Ideas.
Thank you. It's great to be on our podcast.
It's great to have you. And really the topic we're talking about today is, I think, one of those types of conversations that can really serve to elevate the way we talk about everything else. And I say that because here at Sutherland Institute, we are just rolling out a new statement of principles, a collection of things that we believe that we're kind of offering to the world, so to speak, and hoping and encouraging others to see the value in those ideas as well. And as we roll out this statement of principles, we've refined a mission and vision statement for Sutherland Institute, and we'll, of course, link to everything in the show notes. But Rick, the importance of having this conversation with you in particular is this idea of we're offering this set of ideas to voters, to policymakers here in America in this time on purpose because of the contentious political era that we're in. So first, I want to ask you, because this statement of principles prefaces this time of great conflict that we're in, why do you think we need to have a conversation about re-anchoring to and retethering to grounding principles?
Well, I do think it's timely, both in terms of an election year, a contentious election year at that, but also one that's been touted as, if we don't make the right decisions, it may be the last election of our lifetimes. When I hear comments like that, it's clear just how far we've strayed from the principles of this government we are blessed to live under. And government can be used in two ways. There is the structure of government, which has grown greatly over time, but there are the principles of governance that the founders defined for us. And I think it's critically important that we sort through all of the noise, the social media versions of news and fact, and anchor ourselves, re-anchor ourselves. The principles have always been there. One of the things that strikes me about our statement of mission and vision and what we actually do, and those within Sutherland know this well, it's nothing new. And it's nothing new because the principles upon which we operate are nothing new. But they are getting lost, and they are getting edited into a different version of truth, and that concerns me greatly. I think it's high time we return to a baseline truth.
So let me ask you in maybe a really blunt way, for listeners out there who may be thinking, okay, well, why should I care what some policy think tank in Utah has to say? There's a lot at stake in this election year, and just, again, this era politically we find ourselves in. So that's the first question: is why is what we believe from Sutherland Institute important to Utahns and Americans, and why should regular people care? Why would it make a difference in their lives?
Yeah, it's a good question. An organization like Sutherland, I believe, is critically important today because most of the sources of information that people are impacted by today are typically, broadly, a candidate running for something, a surrogate seeking to further a candidacy, a social media news outlet trying to catch your attention through clicks and likes. Not that those have no value, but clearly they have an agenda. Sutherland, on the other hand, is not running for anything. We don't endorse candidates. We don't endorse political parties. So when we talk about a version of whether you use a word like conservatism or Americanism or classical liberalism, when we use those phrases, we're not furthering a party, we're furthering principles. And I think it's safe to say our political parties today, if you study your history, have evolved on their adherence to principle. They have evolved on their adherence to platform issues. But what hasn't changed is Sutherland's voice adhering to founding principles, or as one economist calls them, and I like the phrase, our founding values. So we're a consistent voice, not influenced by the politics of the day.
And to that point, I mean, people obviously look at these things in the context of the politics of the day. So for our listeners out there, a lot of them may be evaluating, well, who do I vote for this fall? Here in Utah, of course, we recently concluded a primary election process that our listeners participated in as voters, fulfilling their civic duty there. But if you look at national polling, we're all familiar with many of the national polls showing how much broad dissatisfaction there is with, right now, the two major party candidates. And I would say more broadly with kind of just the political system, the way it's operating or failing to operate, rather. And so in the context of that, just there's broad frustration. You've spoken before when you've been on this podcast even that there is a majority out there that's kind of fed up with the political contempt, the hyper-partisan back and forth, and they're exhausted. So for those folks who, again, are staring down an election where they have to make a choice as a voter, and they're evaluating, what is my role? What should I do if I care about America, care about the health of the American experiment? What am I supposed to do as a voter in this moment? What it seems to me is we want to help them pivot back to the idea of principle, of grounding values. I like the term values, but why do you think that's a solution? Because that may not necessarily answer their question of who do I vote for in the various elections I look at. How do I fix everything right now that's wrong with our politics? But it is a solution. Why do you think that it's an important step to fixing and healing our political contemptuous culture right now?
Yeah, it's a great question. So it's easy in our busy lives. We can all fall victim to short-term memory. And an upcoming generation knows nothing other than what they see today. So when we see contentious politics, I've heard so many people say, specific to this election, and this is about the only thing I'll say about this election, how did we get these two candidates again? People seem to be either lamenting that or cheering that. Whatever your position may be, if you're on the side of frustration, it's a really good moment to stop and ask yourself that question from a different perspective. How did we get these two candidates again? It didn't just happen. And to the extent that it did just happen, we abdicated a responsibility and allowed it to happen. This representative form of government that we are so blessed to live under is not the easiest form of government. If we step back and allow a government to happen to us, instead of take our active role in the government we have been warned that's exactly what we'll get. It will be imposed upon us. People do forget in moments of frustration, in moments of contempt, that elections matter, that their participation matters. And as we look at federal candidates, we need to realize those are connected to our federal delegations, to governors we elect, to constituencies that we build in these great laboratories of government that are the states. Those local decisions are reflected in national candidates. If we're unhappy with those candidates, we need to ask ourselves the question, how did we get here? How did that happen? What was my role in that? It's interesting that as people feel a separation from, again, when some feel that government is something that happens to them, it's easy to say this doesn't work anymore. They call for a revolution, sometimes a violent revolution. I'm a real believer those calling for violent revolution have not studied our original American Revolution enough. That is not the best choice. The best choice is to adhere to the principles of a framing of government, unlike anything the world has ever seen, that gives us the ability to achieve revolution without bloodshed, without violence. And if we lose grasp of those principles, well, then outrage might seem a viable alternative. But we have so many options within this structure of government, and we need to remind ourselves, we need to study those, particularly those, again, from an upcoming generation who only know what they see today. I urge them, I plead with them to spend a little time studying a history that they've been told is no longer accurate. I assure you, not every history book we've all grown up with is so inaccurate that you would not benefit from a greater understanding of representative government.
So let's give people these principles that hopefully they can use. And I'm thinking this in terms of a listener out there who's very frustrated with the current political environment. I think it'd be hard-pressed to find an American who is not at all frustrated with politics today. Someone is going to say, oh, everything's great and wonderful. I want to talk to that person to understand them. But for folks who are just, they're fed up, they're tired, they're exhausted, they're frustrated, angry, whatever they're feeling in this moment, this document that Sutherland has produced, again, seems to me to be an aspirational call to remind folks what it really means to be an American, what it really means to love and respect and want to build up the American idea. And in this document, it highlights themes such as defending America's founding, those founding principles we talk about, strengthening our civic institutions. It also talks about preserving Utah as America's last great hope, hearkening back to a Reagan quote. There's a reference to our governor when he makes that comparison, and also promoting the three pillars of faith, family, and freedom. So giving that quick overview, I want to ask you to sort of give a voter your elevator pitch. And I love the analogy of you're actually in an elevator. If you got 30 seconds and a regular Utah voter out there says, hey, you're Rick Larsen, you're president of Sutherland Institute. I'm really fed up with politics today. What can you give me that can help me figure out how to navigate this world that I'm in as a voter? How are these principles helpful? What's your elevator pitch of here's what Sutherland believes, here's why you should believe it too, and here's how together we can help actually make a difference in this country? What do you say to that voter?
Yeah, it's challenging. Elevator speeches are interesting and tend to change depending on who's in the elevator with you. But the basics, the very foundations of what Sutherland believes include this. We live today, still today, in the greatest nation on earth. And that's not nationalism speaking, and that's not arrogance speaking. We have been blessed. We have been given the framework, the architecture, unlike any other nation prior. It's interesting, if people would study their history, they would realize the Constitution that survives today in America, other countries have been through a dozen versions of their Constitution since we implemented ours, trying to get it right. There was a tremendous prescience, and those principles are not outdated by current occurrences. Many think that, I hear it referred to as an outdated document. It's not outdated. It's an opportunity to realize the brilliance of these principles applied in a new setting. So always a feeling of gratitude needs to precede whatever we do next. The next thing that Sutherland would remind people of is policy is not politics. Politics is the arena within we must play to achieve sound public policy. But one of the challenges we face today is we are seeing gridlock in our federal government precisely because it was designed to reach gridlock in points of extreme disagreement. So the answer to that could be a sweeping partisan switch one way or another, or it could be principled debate. Principled debate is where we seem to be falling down. Sutherland is an advocate for principled debate, not as weakness, not as surrendering your side. We in Utah certainly have metrics that show us to be an unusually prosperous and functional state at a state government level, at community levels, at family levels. There are reasons for that, and it's not because everybody in Utah immediately abandons their principles if somebody disagrees with them. The reason for this kind of success and prosperity, even through very difficult times, is because Utahns more clearly share core values, and those can be included in debates and in conversations. And so rather than political warfare every time there's a disagreement, there is a tendency to try and agree with one another, to try and fall back to those things that matter, which not by coincidence are our pillars of faith, family, and free enterprise. We believe in those as a state. The majority of Utahns believe in those as a state. And I think the majority of Americans believe in those as foundational principles, but we're getting lost in a fear of looking weak, of backing down to a louder voice, of saying, I know what I think, but I'm not getting into this argument. And so we're becoming more and more dysfunctional as to how we debate policy, not politics, policy. If you're going to debate politics, you're going to get into the nuance of candidates and their personality and their state of being and all these things that we may or may not be able to find right answers to. But on policy, we can solve so many of the issues facing us today if we would take the politics out of it just for one sound debate.
And you're reminding me, in some of my past vocational roles, I was told, and I saw in action, that this is a simplification, but people who work in this industry, so to speak, can usually be sort of filtered into two categories: political operatives and policy wonks. There's certainly crossover. There's certainly a blending of those two things. But I saw that to be true. There are people who just have more of a proclivity to just political combat and strategy and those kinds of things. And there can, of course, be a valuable role for that. And then others who are more, they just want to learn about and further and debate good policy. And in my own view, have always viewed politics as a vehicle for policy, that in some ways politics is a necessary evil. It's kind of annoying sometimes. We all recognize that. But when done properly, you can minimize the annoyance and maximize its potential as a vehicle for robust policy debate. Politics is the form or the vehicle for finding better policy solutions, which inevitably means, as you're saying, principled debate and robust, passionate, vigorous debate, but in pursuit of better ideas rather than in pursuit of just tearing down an opposing team or person. And I think that's the important distinction between politics and policy. But I want to talk about how to really try and start applying this. And I want to go through some aspects of this document that Sutherland's produced and really get a little bit specific of the principles, why we think all Americans should find this broadly popular, should rally around these ideas, and maybe how we can actually apply this to some of the specific policy debates we have in this era. And there's one thing that really stands out to me about this document, and that is that there are kind of these two pillars of defending America's founding and strengthening our civic institutions. We hear a lot from various sectors in political life of this idea of, well, it's your rights. No one can infringe on your rights. You don't hear enough about responsibilities. And I think that's what this document brings, is defending the founding principles of what we have a right to do has to be talked about in context of what we have a responsibility to do. And that, to me, seems to be our founding principles and our civic institutions. I want to read an excerpt of this and ask you to react and expand on it. The statement of principles from Sutherland Institute says, "We affirm the ideals enshrined in America's founding documents, the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution, as the bedrock of American governance, enterprise, and liberty. Political and policy debates are elevated when imbued with greater fidelity to the American constitutional order in law, policy, and culture." And then the second part on civic institutions, it says, "The core institutions of civil society, including families, communities of faith, and the free enterprise system, are indispensable to fostering a functional culture that equips citizens for the rigors of self-government. The erosion or politicization of our civic institutions is a threat to the American experiment and is best combated by restoring those institutions to their proper role." Going through that, Rick, why do you think those two things need to be done together? We can't really do one or the other, but it's the founding principles, our rights guaranteed by the Constitution, but also these essential civic institutions. We can't just do one versus the other. We have to do both.
Yeah, and on the heels of an incredibly long elevator speech, it was a tall building I was preparing for. These concepts need to be explored. Let's just talk about the constitutional structure and the intention. And again, all of this is no further away than it's at our fingertips to be researched, to be understood. So let's give an example of why it feels so dangerous today and how we are out of compliance with constitutional structure. It may or may not surprise anyone. You may remember this from a civics class long ago, or I challenge you to Google it if you've not experienced this in your educational journey. There are points in history where we have watched the constitutional structure of our country change. There's reference to things like the imperial presidency. The president was never intended, and the executive office was never intended to lead a competitive party. The president was intended at the executive level to represent all Americans. And through crisis, through some very legitimate reasons over time, the presidency has assumed new authority that it's never relinquished. But you would see in earlier times, the constitutional structure never favored executive orders as a form of lawmaking. That was to be the job of Congress. The House, a more locally connected, raucous, combative branch, and the Senate, a more deliberate and thoughtful branch to balance and debate. And through that balanced debate, decisions would be made, law would be made, budgets would be approved. And should those ever fall into controversy, a non-political court, the judiciary branch, would be the arbiter and would define, based on constitutional principles, the meaning of the law. Not write new law, not become a political extension. So that quick civics lesson is to say, if you look at the breakdown between those separations of powers today, you need not wonder why we have a problem. You have the court that's completely political. You have a dysfunctional Congress that is just waiting to get dominant power in what they view as all three branches. They want justices leaning their way, they want majorities in the House and Senate, and they want their party in the White House. Well, history shows that is really not likely to happen on an ongoing basis. And we haven't proven terribly effective when those majorities are in place because we still can find reasons to disagree. So I'm stating that those as institutions, we're losing our trust in them because they've lost their way on constitutional structure. So as voters, we should have two demands. We should demand that our elected representatives do better, that they hold to that constitutional structure for all of the reasons cited within the Constitution, for all of the protections, the checks and balances, the ability to get things done for the good of most Americans. Within that, we have to demand of ourselves we understand it a little better, that we vote for different reasons, that we don't vote on a charismatic personality, on an extreme agenda, on pure notions of fighting back against something. We need to be very careful when we vote for someone who's against everything but has very little to say about what they're for, how they would solve the problem, how they would move things forward. So this is why personal responsibility, constitutional structure, and institutions are vitally integrated, because the most critical institutions at our governance level are these branches of government down into our local and state governments. But the most critical institutions move down below that, following from education down into community values, into values taught by families in the home. If you begin to reconnect those with continuity, what's discussed in the home, the values that you consider important, that you teach your children, should find their way into the White House. They should find their way into Congress. Today, we're not achieving that very well.
It seems that there are an increasing number of people who ignore what is happening in those very close personal or intermediary institutions in favor of fixating on what's happening in the White House, in Congress, at the Supreme Court. And it sounds like your point is, look, if you care about the American experiment, you want it to continue to be successful, focus first on what's happening within the four walls of your home. I think of my responsibility as a husband and a father and to our kids and what my role is there, my responsibility to my local faith congregation, to my neighbors, and kind of the concentric circles that come out from that you look at, well, my town, There are a lot of other forms institutions can take as far as, again, local community-based organizations and relationships that we have with one another as neighbors, but then also the free enterprise system and how I engage in commerce with my fellow Utahns, and even just my state and my local and state representation here in Utah. So in that sense, there are, by the time you even get to Congress, the White House, the Supreme Court, if you've done it right, you've gone through many other layers of institutional support to help you live your life and fulfill your duty as an American, to help each other do the same thing. And it seems like if people are sort of shredding those or ignoring those, then it's no wonder that we have so much controversy and angst and contempt fixated on 9 people who are sitting on the U.S. Supreme Court, or particular members of Congress, or the presidency. That if it, maybe to put it another way, it doesn't surprise me that people feel like, a comment you made at the beginning, that this election could be the last one. This is our last hope. Because if everything rests on who's sitting in the White House, if the entire fate of the American experiment depends solely and completely on who gets elected president and is sitting in the Oval Office, then it's no wonder that it feels like the stakes are so high that we are willing to violate other principles to achieve the end we want, because we've ignored all the institutions that we should be focusing on to help us prevent these problems before we get to this sort of existential crisis we're in now.
There's nothing happening in current political races in the White House or in Congress that prevents any of us from sitting around the dinner table with our family and teaching them a love of freedom, a love of their country, a work ethic, teaching them to keep their word, to be honest, to view others as people of value and a people who deserving of dignity. Now, as isolated as that may seem, every day members of every household go out into their communities and interact in other institutions. We go to work, we go to school, we go to meet with a congregation on a chosen day of the week or through activities throughout the week. We go work in nonprofits, we volunteer our time. We take those attitudes with us. If we take more combative, dissatisfied, ungrateful, rebellious attitudes into those same institutions, I believe these attitudes are equally contagious. Further, as families, we have the ability to agree among our neighbors and in our communities and in our congregations of faith, we're going to do this better. And could I just say, because this comes up as a counterpoint all of the time, we're seeing the consequences of deciding that teaching love of country is a bad thing. If you look at what's going on in the EU and the UK and really in countries all over the world, when we lose our ability to identify with the values and principles that say, I am an American, that is not some expression of humility. That is a disconnect from the very values, the very institutional values that have made us who we are. We believe in those values of honesty, of hard work, of a faith in a higher power, of a commitment to family. Those form us into the nation we've become. And all you need to do is look with an objective eye at news stories and what's happening in your community and what's happening around the world. Look at the disconnect between those values. When we no longer consider those important, we behave in a way that is not conducive to freedom for anyone.
Let's speak optimistically, because it's so easy in these kind of conversations to sort of settle into a doom and gloom outlook. And I'm not saying that's what you're articulating, but this politics is serious business, and it's frustrating at times, and it's stressful at times, and at times there are important questions, there are high stakes, but there's a lot of cause for optimism and hope that we should sort of lean into this idea that there are so many examples of things going well that we don't realize. And there is so much cause for I would say, even a joyfulness of the fact that we get to live in the United States of America today, even in the midst of the various problems that we're talking about. One of those bright spots is the state of Utah. And it's easy for those of us who are Utahns who live here. I think you can go to any state website and they're going to say some version of, oh, we're the best state for families and enterprise and the best state to live, work, and play and retire and those kinds of things. But I really believe there actually is something unique about Utah. And this is reflected in the statement of principles from Sutherland. I want to read another quick excerpt This is in the section where it's talking about preserving Utah as America's last great hope. The statement reads, Utah Governor Spencer J. Cox said in his 2022 State of the State address that, quote, if America is the last great hope of the world, then Utah is the last great hope of America, end quote. We agree. Rick, what is so special about Utah? And maybe weave in why it matters that Sutherland Institute is anchored here in Utah that should give cause for optimism for all of us that these principles we're talking about, they actually can work today because they are working here in Utah. What is unique? What help build on what the governor said? Why is Utah the last great hope of America? And what is Sutherland's role in helping that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think not only is it important to explain to those outside of Utah what's special about Utah, I think it's important to remind those who live in Utah what's special about Utah. Sometimes we do the right thing without thinking, and we realize the benefit without connecting the two. Let's just say, for example, you adopted the habit of running. You love to run, you run every day. You're going to realize certain health benefits, whether you stop and think, that's why I run, or I feel this way because I run. And you can take that down to all kinds of behaviors that you realize a benefit from, even if you forget to make the connection over time. Utah does, and the observation from the outside is that because of what may statistically still be within striking distance of being a predominant faith, that's why things go so well in Utah. But I would point out, it's not a faith, it's communities of faith that make Utah special. We have a very vibrant Jewish community, a very vibrant Catholic community. We have immigrant communities who bring different beliefs with them and very devoutly build community around those faiths. Why is that important? Because data has shown time and time again that those who live with a feeling that they were meant for something higher or will one day answer for their behaviors tend to behave and treat others very differently. They view others as connected to them in a spiritual sense, and they believe that they owe them a certain behavior, a certain do unto others. If you remove that dynamic, one scholar has gone so far to say that that attitude actually plays into rule of law. We're more likely to follow the laws in a beneficial way and for the good of society if we believe in laws that govern our behavior as human beings. So Utah has many and diverse, vibrant communities of faith. That's one reason. And that trickles into all kinds of things. That tends to create strong family formation. That tends to create a lesser dependence on government because we tend to take care of each other. And given that dynamic, we're less likely to go sit down in the chambers of the House and Senate and lose all of those values. So even though there is a partisan majority in Utah, that again is a bit of a misnomer because there are a lot of divisions within a party majority of what they consider is important. But what they consider important first and foremost is the well-being of the family, the well-being of their business, taking care of a state that we feel we're stewards of. And those things translate in political decisions, large and small, and into community interactions, large and small. Utah, and any community where you have these factors of faith, family, honesty, a work ethic, they tend to do better over time, and you can look many of these up. We recover from natural disasters quicker because we help one another. We're not dependent on outside aid. We tend to build more and faster because we believe in progress and in prosperity. We tend to support one another in the support of in the pursuit of a business because we believe in those principles of free enterprise. So that's why you get business magazines saying it's a great place to do business. That's why you see that we fared better through economic downturns and we recover more quickly than a lot of states because we work together. We depend on each other, and whatever partisan differences might come up, at the end of the day, those are very secondary to these other priorities and principles.
So those are kind of the first two of the three buckets of faith, family, and freedom that Sutherland has been anchored to for a long time, and this new document sort of reinvests in those principles. And based on what you're saying, maybe the way I would articulate it is that the unique value proposition of Utah that Utah offers to the rest of the country by virtue of its lived experience. It's practicing these things in real life and sort of saying to other states, hey, this is what works. And of course, we offer that to anyone else who's interested in those ideas. But it's in the context of faith, it's the dual-pronged value of religious freedom and the presence of faith-based communities and individuals and organizations, that it's both the rights of people to live and worship and live their faith are and should be protected, and there's always room for improvement, but we do a good job of that here in Utah. But also that there's something, as you're articulating, there's just something good about having communities, organizations, individuals who are motivated by faith present in your community, in your state, being part of public life. And I think that also creates room for folks who are not necessarily a believer of any particular set of faith beliefs themselves, or maybe they don't participate in a particular congregation, but that recognition of that again should be broadly applicable, regardless of what you personally believe. We all should be able to recognize that religious freedom is an intrinsic good and should be protected, and that these communities, organizations, individuals who are motivated by faith to serve their fellow man is also a good thing for society. And then the family aspect of it, as you've alluded to earlier in our conversation, in many ways it is the most fundamental of institutions. And the document also references things like the role of parents as the ones chiefly responsible for the care and education of their kids, the impact that's overwhelming in the data, the positive correlation between married two-parent households and outcomes for kids later in life downstream. So to focus on those two for a moment, I want to ask, how do we start to take these ideas and apply them to the specific policy challenges of the day? Because in my mind, it's one thing to say, well, here are a bunch of great sounding principles that we can read and say, hey, this sounds awesome. But then you find yourself in the middle of a specific policy debate and you're trying to figure out what to do on a given issue. How do we take these principles and then apply it to those specific issues to actually make progress?
It's a great question. There's a lot to talk about here. I'm going to give you a couple of examples of how much truth matters and how much truth could drive our debates and discussions rather than the divisive attacks that are occurring whenever you bring something up. Data matters. You know, you can't deny anyone what they may call their own truth when it comes to living their personal experience, but data matters, and there is data attached to policy decisions we make. A dear friend and brilliant scholar named Ian Rowe realized early in his life and in his academic career that some of the things he was hearing about the Black community didn't sound right. And as a person of color, he began to examine some of the data points. And as a now very advanced scholar, he tears into existing data. For instance, I believe in 2001, there was a Federal Reserve study that showed a significant income gap between Black and white families. Well into $165,000 income gap between white and Black families. If that was the end of the data and the debate, your policy mind would say, we have got to close that gap. And it seems to be racial. It seems to be based on racial factors and zip code and all the things that well-intended policymakers would now double down on those issues. Ian took that data and said, you omitted a data point, and that it's two-parent households, and also the influence of education on those two-parent households. When Ian factored back in education and a two-parent household, the data flipped. Black families with two-parent households and a level of education were actually making more money than this conglomerate of white families of single-parent households and so forth. Now, let's not for a moment sound like we're criticizing single parents. We're not. We're saying data shows that intact two-parent households have certain advantages socially and economically, and the children benefit from those advantages. Thus, a better personal decision-making, maybe making sure you're married before you bring children into this world, has an economic, not just a religious or a faith-based connotation. But that data matters because now we're not arguing about race and class and haves and have-nots. We're saying, well, if that's true, we should be facilitating public policy that encourages family formation, that encourages education, that encourages personal agency and decision making. Those are different policy decisions than those based purely or seemingly on race. So again, let's bring fact to the argument if we're going to have these policy debates.
The third category, I want to make sure we get to this because we're almost running out of time, but there's so much in this to try and cram it into one episode. But that third category of freedom, that again, in some ways is maybe the most broad of sort of the three pillars that Sutherland really focuses on. But one of the things I love about this document is it talks about the notion of freedom in the context of yes, limited government, individual liberty, as those are very important, and also equality before the law. But also this idea of the freedom to pursue the American dream and the power of the free enterprise system, but it also makes specific reference to the realization that there are people who struggle with poverty, and a free enterprise system is throughout history. You can look in the history of mankind, and if you were to graph it out, the bar dramatically shoots upward in very recent history when free enterprise became more of a fixture in Western society, that people were getting out of poverty, literacy rates improved, mortality rates decreased. I mean, there's so many good examples of its impact, but also the recognition that there are still people who struggle to obtain the American dream. I think sometimes folks who espouse these ideas get beat up a little bit, saying, well, you're just about survival of the fittest and free enterprise, and let people who don't succeed, just let them languish. And I want to quote another well-known scholar and friend of Sutherland Institute, but Arthur Brooks. And one of what I think is one of the most important works is The Conservative Heart, where he references in that, and he's quoted himself often, saying that we should push opportunity to the people who need it most, the people who are on the margins of society. And I love that way of approaching it, as free enterprise is powerful and impactful in a positive way. But some people don't have access to free enterprise in the same way. We need to help them have access to that. So I want to ask, how do you view freedom as kind of this, maybe a catch-all? I don't know, that it's enterprise and free speech and free and fair elections and the constitutional order, rather than it just being sort of a talking point and a generic phrase of, well, we love freedom. It means something to Sutherland. It means something to Utahns and Americans. What do we need to remind people that the word freedom, it means something very specific and very powerful if we're willing to apply it in the right way?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I'm going to go to two extremes. First of all, this freedom in the freest country in the world, the United States of America, it was during the Lyndon Johnson administration when the war was declared on poverty. By all kinds of metrics, you can point to highlights as a pocket of success, but overall, poverty has remained relatively flat in the United States. What has changed is dependence on government programs. So have we made people more free, independent, able to pursue their dreams, or have we made them more dependent upon assistance? I like to contrast that with some work I had in my previous career working with microfinance organizations around the world, where you would go in with very small amounts of money to families in very impoverished areas of the world and give them just a little bit of help. And with a little bit of help, they would open a store, they would begin to produce more than they needed for their own existence. They would begin to dream and have ideas. And I can point to dozens and dozens of those families around the world that I have met who are now sending their kids to school, who now live in a home. And and what you saw there, as opposed to a massive government program, is personal initiative given a little bit of help. So I think in the public policy arena, it's incumbent upon us to try and develop policy that empowers people, that gives them agency, that allows them to move forward, to make those decisions, to dream those dreams unencumbered, rather than becoming more and more reliant, often generationally, on assistance, that without that assistance, they would be right back where they were.
Rick, as we begin to close the conversation, I want to share an experience and then kind of ask you a final question of what are our marching orders to the listeners out there? How can we go and be champions of these ideas in the way we vote, the way we act in our own institutions and our families, our faith congregations, our communities, and for those of us who do work in the policy or political space, our elected officials and their staffers, of course, I want to ask you about what we do now. How do we take these ideas and implement them, and what you hope will be the impact in a positive way on American politics and our political culture more broadly. But first, there's an experience that I think is really relevant to this. I was in Washington, D.C. recently within the last couple months, and one of the days I was there, I have a brother who lives out there, and he and I got a chance to go and visit the Arlington National Cemetery. We walked around a little bit and looking at everything, and it had been years since I'd been there. So it was almost like being there for the first time, even though I had remembered it. But in particular, there was the JFK Memorial, where they have various quotes inscribed in stone on kind of this hill that overlooks the entire cemetery. And there is one that stood out to me that feels very pertinent to all of us right now, and I want to read it and use that to help frame our closing remarks. The quote on this stone at the JFK Memorial was, "In the long history of the world, only a few generations have been granted the role of defending freedom in its hour of maximum danger. I do not shrink from this responsibility. I welcome it." Rick, that quote stood out to me because, again, it is so easy to look at everything that's going on and feel so frustrated, so tired, so exhausted, sometimes scared and angry. I think there's a lot of Americans out there that feel like there's something special about America that's under threat. It's being eroded. We're at risk of losing it. And it's this feeling of consternation that I wish I didn't have to live in this era. Why couldn't I grown up in the 80s or the 50s or whatever time people look back and say, well, those were the good old days. But this quote reminds me that what a privilege it is to live in a time when we actually need people to defend the principles of freedom. This feels like one of those times in the United States, and these principles feel like a roadmap to help us do that. So I want to ask you, in that context, again, enlist all of us as soldiers, happy warriors in this effort. What do we do now? What's next? How do we take these principles in this election year, in future years? What can we actually do to implement these ideas, and what do you hope the positive impact will be in Utah and all across America?
Arlington is a sacred place, and it causes you to think deeply. An interesting description of the moment we live in. In those periods of wartime, a common enemy actually united Americans against the common foe. We knew who the enemy was, we knew who we were fighting for, and we were prepared to take up arms or to sacrifice in any way necessary at home to support those fighting the war. Today, it's less clear who the enemy is. We feel like it could be coming from anywhere. We feel like it's a child we send off to college and comes home with a different ideology. We feel like it's a neighbor who flies a flag that we would never want to see in our neighborhood. We feel like our own politicians may be the enemy. They say things on news hits that don't sound right to us. We need a different kind of patriot today, more immersed in the values and principles. Because you can't take up arms, you shouldn't take up arms against your neighbor. Let's not go to that, because we've been blessed, and we should be hopeful because we have a structure of government where we can host a revolution in our own home, neighborhood, community, congregation, state house that will permeate the federal government if we patiently and consistently apply those principles. It's a different kind of a battle. All battles seem to take a while. They're not won overnight. But this one should be a hopeful conversation that begins in our own homes. I would challenge people to do this. If you are fighting this strange new battle on one side or the other of an ideology, I would challenge you to read a little bit about the other side. I would challenge you to look for areas where those intersect, that you may say to yourself, it seems like we're fighting for the same thing, maybe in a very different way, but it seems like we're fighting for the same thing. You can turn the temperature down. You can teach your children a love of history and of this nation. You can take control of those things you have influence over, and it's in concentric circles. We can influence each other. The same vitriolic talk show hosts who get people angry enough to take to the streets, that same influence can be exerted by someone talking about principles, values, virtues, and positive behaviors. And we can't live in fear of that more vitriolic approach. We can overcome it. We've got to overcome it, but it's going to require a little bit of work and a little bit of pushing our own character, those of us who believe in the greatness of this country, who believe in freedom, who love our families, who live on influenced by faith and want to treat others with dignity and respect, we're not the minority, and we're not wrong. And we just need to learn to practice that in a more consistent way with an objective of sharing it in a positive way. You'll never win shouting someone down. A good argument is never conveyed by insulting someone. A good argument wins on merit. Let's understand those good arguments and make them on merit.
Well, Rick, I feel motivated and inspired, and I hope our listeners do as well. I wish we could keep going through this, but we'll leave it there. I think that's a great place to end. That, again, it's a call to each of us individually. This isn't just let's blame politicians or blame our system of government. This is the role of self-government. Self-government is hard, and it takes time and effort, but that's what is before us. That's the blessing that we get to even engage in self-government here in the United States. So I want to thank you for your time walking us through these new principles to sort of reinvigorate this commitment of what has made America great and what we can continue to espouse to protect its greatness for many years to come. So, Rick, thanks so much for being with us on this episode today.
Great. Thank you, Nick. I love this country. I love the people in it. We can do this.
Well, that will do it for our conversation with Rick Larsen, President and CEO here at Sutherland. We're going to take a quick break before we leave you with some final talking points. This is Defending Ideas. We'll be right back.
Sometimes it's hard to keep up with the latest policy debate that affects your life. The solution? Subscribe to Sutherland Institute's weekly newsletter, where you'll find in-depth insights from seasoned policy experts, compelling multimedia, and advance notice of special events. Visit sutherlandinstitute.org.
Welcome back to Defending Ideas. Before we close this episode, I want to do something a little bit differently. Rather than sharing kind of our standard talking points, I do want to share some key points that I captured from our discussion with Rick today, but also share a couple more excerpts from the Sutherland Statement of Principles, because I think it will help each of us in our conversations essentially know how to navigate our role as voters, as members and leaders of institutions, perhaps as policymakers, so that we can execute our role in a better way to help this grand, wonderful experiment of American self-government be more successful moving forward than maybe it's felt in recent years with all the political contempt that we've seen. And I want to read a couple excerpts from the statement in particular. Times of great conflict call for an urgent recommitment to the principles that preserve freedom, so that, in the words of Abraham Lincoln, this nation under God shall have a new birth of freedom, and that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from the earth. America's current political landscape is indeed in a time of great conflict. To that end, Sutherland offers a guide for principled citizens, urging a recommitment to and renewed application of time-tested principles for a new birth of freedom to flourish in our nation. The way we apply that is, number one, defending America's founding ideals, the principles we strive for. Number two, strengthening the core institutions of civil society that are essential for those principles. And number three, recognizing that public policy and political culture most effectively pursue the aspirational ideas of the American founding when aligned with three guiding values of faith, family, and freedom. Many call such time-tested principles conservatism. Others invoke terms like classical liberalism, traditionalism, or even simply Americanism. What matters more than the label we use is the fidelity to these principles we demonstrate. We ask you to join us in this mission. That will do it for this episode of Defending Ideas. We hope that you feel better equipped to understand, articulate, and defend the principles that we talked about today, and that this statement will be a helpful guide for you in whatever role you play in the wonderful American experiment that we are all blessed to participate in. We thank you for your time and are grateful, of course, to Rick Larsen for spending some time with us. If you liked what you heard on this episode, we want to remind you to visit defendingideas.org. From there, you can access previous conversations and video clips. You can also subscribe to this podcast on Apple, Spotify, YouTube, wherever you like to listen to or watch your shows. Just search for Defending Ideas and click the subscribe button. And if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you click the bell icon in the corner so you get notified each time a new episode drops, which is every Tuesday morning. Again, that's defendingideas.org. And if you want to support the broad work of Sutherland Institute, if you want more conversations like this, more principles like this, being carried out into the world so more Americans understand how to defend these important ideas. Please visit sutherlandinstitute.org/donate. That will do it for this episode of Defending Ideas from the Sutherland Institute in Salt Lake City. I'm Nic Dunn. We'll see you next time.